The morning sun had barely crested over the Atlanta skyline when Sarah Henderson's phone erupted with notifications. The screen lit up with messages from the governor's office, fellow judges, and most importantly, her daughter Maya's school confirming her upcoming mock trial presentation. At 52, Sarah had mastered the art of juggling life's complexities, but today was testing even her well-honed capabilities. "Mom, your coffee's getting cold," Maya called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone Sarah often used in court. At 17, Maya was already showing signs of following in her mother's legal footsteps, though Sarah had never pushed her in that direction. Sarah glanced at her reflection in the bedroom mirror, adjusting her charcoal gray suit, the same one she'd worn when she'd made history as the first black woman to argue before the state Supreme Court. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the morning light. These small details mattered. They always had. "The governor's office needs an immediate response," her assistant, James, said through the car's Bluetooth as Sarah navigated her Tesla through Atlanta's morning traffic. "The nomination committee's timeline has been moved up. They're announcing the Chief Justice candidates this afternoon instead of next week." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. 25 years of legal work, countless nights poring over case files, and unwavering dedication to justice had led to this moment. "Send them the confirmation," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "And James, let's keep this quiet until the official announcement." The Tesla's dashboard suddenly flashed a warning, taillight malfunction. Sarah made a mental note to have it checked later, but her attention was drawn to an upcoming meeting with reform advocates. They were pushing for changes in the judicial system, changes she'd been fighting for since her days as a public defender. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, muscle memory from countless conversations with Maya about handling police interactions kicking in. She pulled over smoothly, already reaching for her registration and insurance information. The officer approached, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30. His nameplate read Officer Matthews. His hand rested casually on his belt as he peered into the luxury vehicle, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he registered Sarah's appearance. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying that familiar blend of authority and assumption she'd encountered throughout her career. Sarah handed over her documents, watching in the side mirror as her phone silently lit up with more calls from the governor's office. "Is there a problem, officer? Your taillight's out. You didn't know that." His question carried an edge of disbelief, as if the owner of a Tesla should somehow be more aware of such things. "I just received the warning notification," Sarah replied, gesturing to her dashboard. "I was planning to have it checked today." She kept her voice measured, professional, the same tone she'd used in countless courtrooms. Officer Matthews studied her license, his eyes flickering between the photo and her face. Sarah was accustomed to this moment, the pause where people try to reconcile her appearance with her credentials. Her laptop sat open on the passenger seat, displaying briefs for upcoming cases, but the officer's attention was focused elsewhere. "Step out of the vehicle, please, Mom." Sarah's phone buzzed again. The governor's chief of staff now. With practiced calm, she complied, standing straight in her tailored suit as the morning traffic whizzed by. She thought of Maya, of their conversations about dignity under pressure, about the importance of remaining composed even when facing injustice. "You'll need to appear in court for this citation," Officer Matthews said, already writing the ticket. "The taillight violation is serious, and given the tint of your windows." He let the implication hang in the air. Sarah accepted the citation without comment, knowing that this moment, like so many before it, would soon become part of a larger story. As she watched Officer Matthews return to his patrol car, her phone buzzed one final time. The message preview caught her eye. "Congratulations, Madam Chief Justice Nominee." The marble halls of the Fulton County Courthouse echoed with the usual Monday morning chaos. Sarah Henderson stood in the security line, her mind still processing the whirlwind of events that had led her here. Around her, Lawyers in expensive suits breezed through the priority lane, flashing their bar credentials with practiced efficiency. Next, called the security guard, a veteran named Bill who had worked at the courthouse for over 2 decades. Sarah had known him since her days as a junior prosecutor, but today she deliberately held back her familiar smile. She placed her designer briefcase on the conveyor belt, watching as 2 young clerks huddled excitedly over a newspaper near the metal detector. "Have you seen the shortlist for Chief Justice?" one clerk whispered to the other, holding up the morning's Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Word is they're announcing it today. Look at this one. Sarah Henderson, first black woman ever nominated." The other clerk squinted at the grainy photograph. Impressive resume. Public defender turned district court judge. "But this picture must be ancient. Says here, she revolutionized the juvenile justice system back in 15. Sarah suppressed a smile as she walked through the metal detector. The photo they were studying was indeed old, taken during her swearing in as a district court judge. Back then, her hair had been fully black, styled in the conservative manner she thought would make her more acceptable to the old guard. Now her natural gray streaked elegantly through her hair, each strand earned through years of fighting for justice. "Arms out, please," Bill instructed, not recognizing her without her usual judicial robes. As he waved the security wand around her, Sarah caught more fragments of the clerk's conversation. "My cousin had a case in her courtroom last year," the first clerk continued. "Said she was brilliant but tough. Doesn't let anyone get away with cutting corners, especially prosecutors who aren't prepared." A group of attorneys burst through the main doors, their voices carrying across the lobby. "The nomination's going to change everything," one of them declared. "Henderson's got a reputation for shaking up the system. Half the judges in this building are probably sweating bullets right now." Sarah checked her watch. Still 45 minutes until her hearing. She found a seat in the crowded waiting area, purposely choosing a spot between a teenage boy in a hoodie and an elderly woman clutching a stack of wrinkled papers. The boy reminded her of her nephew Marcus, who she'd represented in his first juvenile case before deciding to become a judge. "You look nervous, dear," the elderly woman said, mistaking Sarah's contemplative expression for anxiety. "First time in court." Sarah smiled warmly. "Not exactly, but it never gets easier, does it?" "Oh Lord, no," the woman chuckled. "Been coming here for 20 years. Started as a stenographer, retired as a clerk. Name's Dorothy." She peered at Sarah more closely. "You know, you remind me of someone. There's this judge they're talking about for Chief Justice." Before Dorothy could finish her thought, a commotion near the elevators drew everyone's attention. Judge Maxwell Roberts had arrived, his black robes billowing as he strode toward his courtroom. Sarah had appeared before him early in her career and had never forgotten how he dismissed her arguments simply because she was a young black woman in a public defender's suit. "All rise," called the bailiff as the judge passed through the waiting area. Everyone scrambled to their feet. Everyone except Sarah, who remained seated, her motion subtly masked by adjusting her briefcase. Judge Roberts didn't even glance in her direction. The teenage boy beside her noticed. "Yo, you're supposed to stand," he whispered urgently. Sarah turned to him with a conspiratorial wink. "Sometimes, young man, respect has to be earned, not demanded." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card, handling it to him. "When you're done here today, call this number. The Urban Justice Initiative is always looking for young people who understand the difference between real respect and just following orders." As the boy stared at the card in amazement, Sarah heard Dorothy gasp softly. The elderly woman had finally placed her face, eyes darting between Sarah and the newspaper the clerks had left behind. Sarah pressed a finger gently to her lips, and Dorothy nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. The intercom crackled. "Traffic violations. Courtroom 3B, Judge Roberts presiding." Courtroom 3B's waiting area felt like a pressure cooker of anxiety and frustration. Sarah Henderson sat quietly, observing the scene before her with the careful eye she'd developed over decades of legal work. To her left, a young mother struggled to keep 3 children quiet while frantically highlighting sections of a legal document with a nearly dried-out marker. "Mommy, I'm hungry," the youngest child whimpered, tugging at his mother's worn blazer. The woman reached into her bag, but Sarah could see the moment of defeat cross her face when she found nothing. "Here," Sarah said softly, pulling an unopened pack of crackers from her briefcase. She always kept snacks handy, a habit from her own days as a single mother in law school. "I have extras." The woman hesitated before accepting. "Thank you." "I'm Maria," she whispered, her voice carrying the edge of exhaustion, familiar to anyone juggling parenthood with legal troubles. "I'm sorry they're so loud. The babysitter canceled last minute, and my ex's lawyer changed some documents." Sarah glanced at the papers in Maria's lap. Even from this angle, she could spot the predatory clauses buried in the legal jargon, the same tactics she'd fought against throughout her career. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the documents. Maria nodded, and Sarah began explaining the dense legal text in clear, simple terms. "See this paragraph? They're trying to modify the custody agreement without explicitly stating it. Always look for what they're not saying directly." As Sarah spoke, she noticed other people in the waiting area leaning in slightly, listening. A middle-aged man with calloused hands set aside his phone. An elderly woman with bifocals stopped pretending to read her magazine. "You sound like you know a lot about this stuff," Maria said, hope creeping into her voice. "Are you a lawyer?" Before Sarah could respond, a sharp cry echoed through the room. Maria's oldest child had accidentally knocked over his brother's water bottle, creating a small puddle on the floor. The court officer started moving toward them, his face stern. "It's handled," Sarah said firmly, already pulling tissues from her bag. She helped the children clean up the spill, positioning herself between them and the approaching officer. The way the officer's demeanor softened at her professional appearance wasn't lost on her. Another example of the biases she'd spent her career fighting. "Your case must be important," Maria observed, noting Sarah's designer suit and briefcase. "I feel bad taking up your time with my problems." Sarah thought about her pending nomination, about the press conference scheduled for later that day where her appointment would be announced. "Every case is important," she replied. "Justice doesn't have a price tag." The waiting room door opened, and a young law clerk entered with an armful of files. Sarah recognized him from her chambers, Daniel, a first-year clerk known for his meticulous research. She watched as recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion at seeing her in the waiting area. "Judge Hen," he began, but Sarah's subtle headshake stopped him mid-word. Understanding dawned in his eyes, and he quickly buried himself in his files. "The thing about the justice system," Sarah continued to Maria, speaking just loud enough for others to hear, "is that it's supposed to serve everyone equally. But sometimes we need to remind those in power what that really means." A court officer appeared at the door. "Next group for Judge Roberts. Please have your citations ready." Maria began gathering her children's things, panic returning to her face. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card, different from the one she'd given the teenage boy earlier. This one had a direct line to her chambers. "Call this number tomorrow," she said quietly. "Ask for Lauren. Tell her Judge Henderson referred you. She'll connect you with resources for single parents dealing with custody issues." Maria's eyes widened at the word judge, but Sarah was already standing, straightening her jacket. Through the doorway, she could see Judge Roberts on his bench, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed files, unaware that his entire worldview was about to be challenged. "Remember," Sarah said, addressing not just Maria but everyone within earshot, "the law may be blind, but those who serve it must learn to see clearly." Judge Maxwell Roberts swept into courtroom 3B like a storm front, his black robes billowing behind him. At 63, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades directing the fates of those who stood before him. The wooden gavel struck the sound block with practiced precision. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Maxwell Roberts presiding. All rise." Sarah rose with the rest of the crowd, observing how the judge barely acknowledged the show of respect. She'd appeared before him 15 years ago as a public defender, watching him dismiss her client's valid arguments with barely concealed disdain. Now, as she studied his face, she noticed new lines around his eyes, a slightly deeper set to his mouth. "First case," Judge Roberts barked, squinting at the docket. "James Chin, inappropriate attire in a courtroom." A young Asian man in a hoodie stepped forward, already beginning to explain. "Your Honor, I came straight from work. In my courtroom, Mr. Chen, we show respect through our actions and our appearance." Judge Roberts interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar lectures. $200 fine. Next time, wear appropriate attire or find yourself facing contempt charges. Sarah watched the young man's shoulders slump as he shuffled away. Her hand tightened around her briefcase, which contained drafts of dress code reforms she'd been preparing for the state court system. Reforms that would prevent judges from imposing arbitrary standards that disproportionately affected working-class defendants. Maria Ramirez, Judge Roberts called next, and Sarah saw the young mother from the waiting room approach the podium, her children mercifully being watched by Dorothy, the retired clerk. "Say your Jews," Maria began, her voice trembling slightly. "I have documentation showing that my ex-husband's lawyer changed the English only in this courtroom. Ms. Ramirez," Judge Roberts cut in, not looking up from his papers. "And where is your legal representation?" "I cannot afford. The court cannot provide special accommodations for every case," he declared, shuffling through the documents with obvious impatience. "Motion denied. Next case." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She'd spent years documenting exactly how this type of dismissive behavior contributed to unequal justice outcomes. Each case that passed before Judge Roberts seemed to illustrate another point from her upcoming reform proposal. An elderly man with a cane was fined for being 2 minutes late. A woman trying to explain a medical emergency that caused her traffic violation was dismissed with a curt, "The law doesn't accept excuses." Each ruling came faster than the last, like a conveyor belt of justice gone wrong. The courtroom clerk, Daniel, kept glancing nervously between Sarah and the judge. She could read the conflict on his face, the desire to alert his superior to her presence, warring with curiosity about what would happen when her case was called. "Your Honor," a young public defender interjected during one case, "my client has evidence that—" "Counselor," Judge Roberts interrupted, his voice carrying the chill of a winter storm, "when I want your input, I'll ask for it. Until then, save your breath and my time." Sarah pulled out her phone silently, typing a quick note about mandatory training for judges on defendant rights and proper courtroom procedure. The irony wasn't lost on her that in less than 24 hours, she would have the power to implement such changes. "Sarah Henderson," the clerk finally called, his voice catching slightly on her name. Judge Roberts didn't even look up, continuing to write notes on a previous case. "Approach the podium," he commanded, his tone making it clear this was just another case to process, another fine to issue, another face to forget. Sarah stood, smoothing her jacket with deliberate care. She could feel the energy in the courtroom shift as those who had witnessed her kindness in the waiting room leaned forward. Maria covered her mouth with her hand. Dorothy smiled knowingly. The teenage boy with her business card sat up straighter. As she walked toward the podium, Sarah thought about all the people who had stood in this exact spot, facing this exact judge, feeling small and powerless. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step bringing her closer to a moment that would change more than just her own future. Judge Roberts finally looked up, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, impatience written across his face. "Well," he demanded, "let's get on with it." "The court sees you're charged with operating a vehicle with a defective taillight," Judge Roberts announced, his voice carrying the same monotonous tone he'd used all morning. "How do you plead?" Sarah stood at the podium, her posture perfect, hands clasped loosely in front of her. The morning light streaming through the high courthouse windows caught her grandmother's pearl earrings, creating a subtle glow. "Before entering a plea, Your Honor, I'd like to present some pertinent information regarding this citation." Judge Roberts' eyebrows lifted slightly at her articulation. His eyes flicked down to the citation, then back to Sarah, performing the same quick assessment she'd watched him do all morning. Categorizing, dismissing, moving on. "Are you an attorney, Miss Henderson?" he asked, the corner of his mouth twitching with what might have been amusement. "You could say I'm in the legal field," Sarah replied, her voice carrying just enough authority to make several heads in the gallery look up from their phones. "If you'll allow me to explain, the citation appears to be based on several incorrect assumptions." The judge leaned back in his chair, making a show of checking his watch. "Ms. Henderson, I've heard every excuse imaginable about traffic violations, unless you have specific evidence. Article 40, Section 12 of the State Vehicle Code," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "specifically states that a citation for vehicle maintenance violations cannot be issued if the operator can demonstrate they were actively en route to address the issue." She pulled out her Tesla's diagnostic report. "As you can see, the warning light activated exactly 7 minutes before the traffic stop, and my GPS history shows I was heading directly to an authorized service center." A whisper rippled through the courtroom. Judge Roberts' face tightened. "Are you a law student, Miss Henderson? Because citing statutes without proper context." "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone she'd used countless times in appellate court, "the officer's supplementary notation about window tint is irrelevant, as per the Supreme Court's ruling in Martinez v. State, which established that secondary observations cannot be used to support a primary traffic violation without independent probable cause." The young clerk, Daniel, was now practically vibrating with anticipation. Judge Roberts removed his reading glasses, his expression darkening. "Ms. Henderson, while I appreciate your enthusiasm for legal procedure, this is a simple traffic court. We don't need to turn this into a constitutional debate." Sarah opened her briefcase, extracting a thin folder. "On the contrary, Your Honor, I believe precedent is always relevant. Just last month, in fact, the appellate court overturned 17 traffic citations from this very courthouse, citing a pattern of insufficient evidence and procedural oversights." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "I believe you're familiar with that case." The color rising in Judge Roberts' cheeks told her he was indeed familiar with it. It had been one of her last rulings before her nomination. Though he hadn't recognized her yet, his body language had shifted from dismissive to defensive. "Miss Henderson," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "are you suggesting this court is somehow biased in its application of traffic laws?" "Not at all, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her smile gentle and her eyes steel sharp. "I'm merely suggesting that justice, like a taillight, works best when all its components are functioning properly and equally for everyone." A muffled laugh from the gallery made Judge Roberts' face flush darker. "I won't have my courtroom turned into a forum for social commentary. The fine is $300. Pay it or appeal it. But we're done here." Sarah maintained her calm demeanor, though her voice carried clearly through the now silent courtroom. "I appreciate the court's time, but I believe it would be appropriate to note for the record that this interaction, from the initial traffic stop through to this ruling, has exemplified exactly the type of procedural inequities that the state Supreme Court addressed in their recent guidance on implicit bias in traffic court proceedings." Judge Roberts slammed his gavel. "One more word, Miss Henderson, and you'll be in contempt. Who exactly do you think you are?" The courthouse doors burst open, and a breathless young woman in a press badge rushed in, followed by 2 court administrators. Sarah could see the moment recognition hit Judge Roberts, his face draining of color as his eyes darted between her and the approaching officials. "Your Honor," Sarah said quietly, "I believe they're here to announce that." Time seemed to freeze in courtroom 3B as the press badge-wearing woman stumbled to a halt, her smartphone already live-streaming. Behind her, The court administrators wore expressions that ranged from mortified to darkly amused. The young clerk, Daniel, had his hand pressed over his mouth, eyes wide with anticipation. "Your Honor," one of the administrators stepped forward, his voice strained. "We need to call a brief recess. There's a press conference." "We're in the middle of a proceeding," Judge Roberts snapped, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. His eyes kept darting between Sarah and the growing crowd at the doorway, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. The reporter's voice cut through the tension. "Judge Henderson, the governor's office just announced your nomination for State Chief Justice. Would you care to comment on what appears to be an interesting morning in traffic court?" The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Maria, still seated with her children, grabbed Dorothy's arm in shock. The teenage boy who had received Sarah's business card earlier whispered an audible, "No way." Judge Roberts' face had achieved a shade of pale that Sarah hadn't previously thought possible. "Ms. Henderson," Judge Roberts started, his voice suddenly honey-smooth, "had I known that I was being considered for Chief Justice," Sarah finished for him, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom, "or that I was a judge at all, that I spent 25 years practicing law, that I graduated top of my class at Yale." She paused, letting each question land like a gentle hammer. Which of those facts would have changed how justice was administered in this courtroom today? The reporter's live stream counter ticked up as viewers poured in. Judge Roberts began to stand, perhaps to call for order, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, a gesture she perfected over years on the bench. To everyone's surprise, including perhaps his own, he settled back into his chair. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the measured tone she used for landmark decisions, "I've spent the morning watching you process cases with the same efficiency you applied to mine. I saw you dismiss a young man for his clothing without asking why he came directly from his night shift. I watched you wave away a mother's valid custody concerns because she struggled with English. I observed as you fined an elderly gentleman for being 2 minutes late, never asking about the bus delays he mentioned to the bailiff." Judge Roberts' mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. The administrators huddled by the door, phones buzzing frantically. "The beautiful thing about justice," Sarah said, reaching into her briefcase once more, "is that it's supposed to be blind to everything except the facts. Blind to status." She pulled out her checkbook. "Blind to titles." She began writing. "Even blind to whether someone might soon be in a position to reform the very system that sometimes forgets its purpose." She detached the check with a crisp motion that echoed through the stunned courtroom. $300, as ordered by the court. She placed it on the podium. "Though I believe an appeal might be instructive for everyone involved." "Judge Henderson," the reporter called out, "will this experience influence your approach as Chief Justice?" Sarah turned to face the camera, but her words were clearly meant for everyone in the room. "Every experience influences justice if we're willing to learn from it. Every person who walks into a courtroom, regardless of their appearance, education, or status, deserves to walk out feeling they were truly heard." She gathered her belongings with deliberate care, noting how Judge Roberts seemed to have aged a decade in the past 5 minutes. Before stepping away from the podium, she leaned in slightly, her voice low enough that only he and the immediate court staff could hear. "The nomination announcement isn't for another hour, max. Plenty of time to finish today's docket." Her eyes met his directly. "I'll be curious to see how the remaining cases are handled." As Sarah walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted like water. The reporter trailed after her, still streaming. But Sarah paused at Maria's seat, speaking quietly to the shocked woman. "Lauren's still expecting your call tomorrow," she said with a warm smile. Justice doesn't end with one morning in traffic court. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as Sarah emerged into the bright midday sun. News vans had already started gathering, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Her phone hadn't stopped vibrating since leaving the courtroom. Calls from the governor's office, fellow judges, and most importantly, her daughter Maya. "Mom, you're trending." Maya's excited voice came through her earpiece as Sarah descended the steps. Someone in the courtroom posted about what happened, and it's everywhere. #JusticeDeserved is blowing up. Sarah spotted James, her assistant, waiting by her Tesla, which now sported a fresh repair ticket on the windshield. She allowed herself a small smile at the irony. "Maya, sweetheart, how's the mock trial prep going? Are you seriously asking about my mock trial when you just pulled off the most iconic moment in legal history? The whole school's watching the live stream. My civil rights teacher stopped class to show it." A reporter broke away from the growing media crowd, microphone extended. "Judge Henderson, was this a planned statement about judicial reform?" Sarah raised her hand in a polite but firm no-comment gesture, continuing her conversation with Maya. "Every moment is a teaching moment, baby. Speaking of which, did you finish your opening statement?" "Mom." Maya's eye roll was practically audible. "Fine. Yes, I finished it. But can we talk about how you just schooled Judge the Hammer Roberts? Aunt Janelle says she's crying proud tears into her coffee." The courthouse doors burst open behind her as more reporters spilled out, but it was the figure who emerged after them that caught Sarah's attention. Judge Roberts, looking somewhat shell-shocked, his robes billowing in the spring breeze. "Maya, I need to call you back," Sarah said, watching as the judge hesitated at the top of the steps. "Love you, and Maya. Make sure that opening statement includes precedent citations." She turned off her phone just as Judge Roberts began making his way down toward her. The reporters fell silent, cameras whirring as they captured this unexpected moment. "Judge Henderson," he called out, his voice carrying a note she'd never heard before, something between humility and revelation. "A word, please." Sarah nodded to James, who smoothly intercepted the approaching reporters, giving her and Judge Roberts a moment of relative privacy near the courthouse's ancient oak tree. "That was quite a performance in there," Judge Roberts began, then winced at his own words. "I mean, what I'm trying to say is, we all have blind spots, Max," Sarah said quietly. "Even me. Especially me. That's why I spend one day each month sitting in different courtrooms, watching justice from the other side of the bench." He blinked in surprise. "You do? How else can we understand the system we're meant to improve?" She gestured toward the courthouse steps, where Maria was emerging with her children, hope replacing the morning's defeat in her posture. "Every person who walks through those doors carries a story. Our job isn't to rush through those stories. Our job is to listen, to understand, and to ensure that justice isn't just a word we throw around, but a reality we create every single day." Judge Roberts was silent for a long moment, watching as more people from the morning session emerged, many stopping to share their stories with the waiting reporters. "I've been on the bench for 23 years, he finally said. Maybe it's time I did some listening of my own." Sarah reached into her briefcase one final time, pulling out a thick folder. "The State Judicial Reform Committee meets every Thursday at 3 p.m. We're currently working on standardizing traffic court procedures and implementing implicit bias training." She held out the folder. "We could use your perspective." He took the folder with slightly trembling hands. "Why?" "After how I treated you, treated everyone in there. Because justice isn't about punishment, Max. It's about growth." She nodded toward the Tesla, where James was finalizing the repair appointment. "Even broken taillights can be fixed, if we're willing to acknowledge they need repair." The first drops of a spring rain began to fall as Sarah finally headed toward her car. Behind her, she could hear Judge Roberts calling his clerk, requesting a review of the morning's cases. Above them, the courthouse's ancient motto caught the rain: "Justice sees all." Today, Sarah thought, it truly had. 6 months had transformed Courtroom 3B from a symbol of rigid authority into a model of judicial reform. The morning sun still streamed through the high windows, but now it illuminated a very different scene. Judge Maxwell Roberts stood at his podium, not in traditional robes, but in a well-tailored suit, addressing a group of judicial candidates. When I asked Ms. Maria Ramirez to speak only English in my courtroom last spring, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, I thought I was maintaining order. What I was actually doing was silencing justice. Today, we have 5 certified court interpreters on staff, and our case resolution rate has improved by 40%. In the back of the courtroom, Chief Justice Sarah Henderson smiled softly. She hadn't planned to attend today's judicial training session, but something had drawn her here, perhaps the same instinct that had led her to accept that traffic ticket 6 months ago. The Henderson Doctrine. Judge Roberts continued, gesturing to a framed traffic citation hanging behind his bench, reminds us that justice isn't about processing cases, it's about serving people. Every person who enters this courthouse deserves to leave feeling heard, respected, and treated fairly. The young man in the front row raised his hand, James Chen, the same one who'd been fined for wearing a hoodie. Now he wore a judicial clerk's badge. How do you balance efficiency with thoroughness? Our dockets are always full. An excellent question, a familiar voice called from the doorway. The room turned to see Maria Ramirez entering, now wearing a paralegal's badge and carrying a stack of files, which is why we implemented the Community Court Advisory Board. Sarah watched with pride as Maria confidently made her way to the front. After that fateful morning, Maria had not only won her custody case, but had also enrolled in paralegal courses through the newly established Judicial Equity Scholarship Program. Her oldest child now participated in the courthouse's youth advocacy program. Chief Justice Henderson called out another voice, the teenage boy she'd given her card to months ago. He was now a regular volunteer in the Youth Justice Program. Will you share your perspective on the reforms? Sarah stood, making her way to the front of the courtroom. The click of her heels on the polished floor brought back memories of that transformative morning. The changes we've seen in this courthouse aren't just about new policies or programs, she began. They're about a fundamental shift in how we view justice itself. She pulled out her phone, displaying a recent statistical report. In the past 6 months, appeal rates have dropped by 60%. Community trust ratings have doubled. But the most important numbers aren't on any chart. They're in the stories of people like Maria, who found not just justice but opportunity in these halls. Judge Roberts stepped down from his podium, joining her. Chief Justice Henderson taught me that true justice requires constant self-reflection. Every morning, I now spend 30 minutes sitting in these gallery seats, reminding myself what it feels like to be on the other side of that bench. The doors opened again, and Sarah's daughter Maya walked in, now a first-year law student. She carried a familiar-looking briefcase, the same one Sarah had brought to traffic court that fateful day. "Mom," she called out, "the governor's here for the reform bill signing." As if on cue, cameras began flashing from the doorway. But Sarah held up her hand, that same gentle yet authoritative gesture that had silenced Judge Roberts months ago. "Before we move to the ceremony," she said, "I want everyone in this room to remember something. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it comes from a broken taillight, a mother fighting for her children, or a judge willing to learn from his mistakes." She turned to address the judicial candidates directly. "Your role isn't just to uphold the law. It's to ensure that justice serves everyone equally, regardless of language, appearance, or circumstance. Remember, every person who walks through those doors brings their whole life story with them. Our job is to listen, learn, and ensure that justice isn't just a word engraved on our walls, but a living principle that transforms lives." As they all rose to head to the signing ceremony, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the courthouse windows, her mother's determination, her grandmother's pearls, and her own hard-won wisdom combining to create something new. A justice system slowly but surely learning to truly see everyone it served.